Hello, everyone. Dr. Nicole Lepera, the holistic psychologist here. I have a treat for you guys. Today, I have my long time, at this point now, it feels like,
Yeah.
BFF on Instagram, Vienna Pharon over at Mindful MFT. I know a lot of my followers are already following her because she's
Yeah.
absolutely amazing. And I brought her on today. We're going to talk all things conflict and couples. And here she is. Thank you so much for being on here today.
Thank you for having me. I know we're like BFF high five, Instagram for the win, bringing good people together. This is fun.
I
This
love
is
it.
fun.
I love
Yeah.
it. So absolutely. I know you do a whole hell of a lot of couples work and you're always
Yeah.
talking about couples. And I think when we think about couples, most of us think about conflict, the challenges of
hmm
couples. So talk to me a little bit about conflict and couples and kind of what your mindset is on all of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you and I talk a lot about sort of the origin stories and the templates of how our programming gets put into motion. And I think conflict obviously is one of those things that a lot of couples like to avoid. And, people want to not fight. Right? They want to bury it. They want to move it away. They don't want to go there because the story around conflict often is something that leads them to disconnection and separation and anger, frustration, chaos, whatever it is. And so, for me, conflict, it can either be the thing that destroys or it's a space where conflict can be, in my opinion, one of the greatest connectors and sort of like intimacy builders that we have. And I think this reframe around conflict is so important, but it definitely takes way more than, counting to 10 and just trying to say things in a kind fashion. It's like, we really struggle with conflict. And for me, I love to start with the origin story and that template of how we saw conflict demonstrated. And for me, I go back obviously to family of origin. I know that you do the same. And bring people's attention to the way in which they saw conflict and bring awareness to, like, was it something that was passive aggressive? Was it something that was one person screaming? Did people shut down and put it under the rug? Was it something that never got resolved? And we start identifying the way in which that template was built out so that we can understand what the programming is doing when we're actually finding ourselves in that threat response in present day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I are in such alignment in terms of considering our past experiences and how
Yeah.
they inform our current ones, particularly
hmm
in couples. So just backing up for 1 second, why? I mean, why is it that we find ourselves in our partnerships? I mean, I'm probably speaking, I know from my own experience, but I think from a lot
Yeah.
of ours, why is it that our closest relationships, our romantic partnerships, if
Mhm.
you will, are the ones that are the most, maybe if they're not the most conflictual, but they get the most heated when
Mhm.
so.
Well, we're spending so much time with those people first. There's something that tends to be really familiar in that space, right? We want to be seen, we want to be understood, we want to be loved and accepted and connected to this person, really more than most people in this world. And so when that threat response gets activated, where, wait a second, you did not hear me, or you did just cross over a line, or I feel betrayed, or I feel embarrassed, or I don't feel seen, heard, connected to you, then the activation happened, and we can go to war there, right? It's like, I need to move myself to safety becomes the number one priority. And that's where we move from couple to individual. I need to move myself to safety. We don't really think about how the system moves to safety. Now, this is really hard, right? Like, and I think you and I are actually quite honest about where we don't do things well, and where it's like, yeah, like, this is the human part of it. It's not that you are never going to have this moment where you try to move yourself to safety. Like, Connor and I will label it, I call him the jackhammer and he calls me the point prover, right? So it's like, when we get into that space, like, he'll like go 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 go, and I'm like, babe, I got it. Like, I actually have understood what I've done that has hurt you. And he
Mhm.
keeps going and going and going, and there isn't that room or space for that connection to happen. So, there's you have to have a little bit of flexibility and humor with this, because we're going to misstep, and we can misstep often, but the goal is to be able to move the system to safety. And why it happens with the people we love is because we get hurt, because those are the people who are supposed to have our backs, who are supposed to love us, who are supposed to see us in a way that feels safe and secure. And then when our human parts come forward, it feels so much more betraying. And it's such a greater letdown for us, because we put so much into that dynamic to sort of hold the container for us to grow and be deeply intimate and expansive and transparent with one another in very vulnerable ways. And when we do that and it doesn't work, it can feel like death, and I don't mean that in a really dramatic way, but it's sort of like this part that just doesn't feel alive and connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's a testament to the depth of the emotional connection. And I love that you have woven in your response that concept of safety, because as far as I see it, and I think traditionally, especially, I don't know how much training, you had in your program, but I think societally, we have this idea that unless you had I think a lot of us are familiar with the big T of trauma, unless you had the big glaring instance of abuse or neglect, that was the only thing that earned you that title of trauma experience. However, I am a big believer in a much more expansive definition. And I'm going to throw out a universal statement right now. I believe most of us humans walking this earth are carrying some version of little t trauma, which to me, and the reason I wrap this in with the concept of safety, is because when we are feeling threatened, we actually do go into a survival-based response. And I love how you worded it. We move from the system, moving to safety, to the individual. And I agree with you. I think that perceptually, even, there's something that happens in our minds. I talk about this often, where our perceptual field shrinks, and we cannot care or can even consider, even if it's the other person that I love more than anyone else on this planet,
right?
They don't matter when we have to remember that this is very evolutionarily based. They don't matter when my safety is what is being threatened. So I love that you wove that in. I think this piggybacks, and going back to what you were offering, we get information about relationships, and in particular, the dynamics and how things like conflict are resolved from a very young age. So not only are we feeling very emotionally threatened in these most intimate connections, but we oftentimes are then drawing upon those models that I know I heard you reference earlier, what we saw happen or not happen when the adults around us, the caregivers around us, not only when they themselves as adults were in conflict, but maybe even what would happen when we were in trouble as a kid. How was conflict handled? And I know that imprints upon us, and then sometimes becomes the way in which we try to navigate conflict, usually unsuccessfully, when we are now in our adult relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about little t trauma. Like, I agree with you 100%. I would say that probably most of us are walking around with, some experience of trauma. And actually recently in a session of mine, I was saying, we tend to see trauma as this like acute moment in a person's life. And if you don't have that acute moment where you're like, yes, that thing that happened to me, and that's my big trauma, right? People don't know what to do with the word. And yet I think that a lot of times trauma is this slow burn that is, very consistent and regular in a person's life, and isn't this acute moment. And so, yes, when we're thinking about conflict, and we're constantly thinking about how we're moving ourselves into safety when we were a part of systems where it wasn't safe, whether it was, having an addict parent, or someone who was, with mental health issues that were not being addressed and were not being, managed well, whether it was a sibling who, had something going on in their life that was taking up a lot of the time and energy and space in the system, that you didn't get attention, and you didn't get connection, and you didn't get what it is that you needed as a child. There's so many different unique experiences that bring us to the space of, I need to protect myself. And when you said, and that's why I said that word before, is like, I'm going to war, right? Like, even though I love you more than anything else in this world right now, all I can see as it shrinks is I need to protect myself and bring myself to safety really at all costs. It's why we become defensive. It's why we become critical. It's why we become contemptuous. Right? It's why we can sometimes stonewall, right? I'm naming all of the four horsemen, John Gottman's work. And it's why we go into that space, because we're like, I'll bring it all out. Whatever I need to do to make sure that I'm okay is what we activate. And so this work, it's not good enough to just know that we do this, right? Our work is to find those moments where we're actually able to pivot and move the things that will always lead us into disconnection with our partners into a space where we can connect. And listen, sometimes that means that we get it wrong the first time, right? Sometimes that means that we do tear at the relationship and we get defensive and we prove our point and we don't want to listen to the other person. But then maybe whether it's 20 minutes or 2 hours or 20 hours or, sometimes a little bit longer, we come back and we say, can we do this again? Because I think I would like to really understand what your experience is. And one of the most important things that I think we have to do is remember that we are both having an internal experience that is so important for us to understand. And when I go back to where I started today, like, conflict for me is some of the most important information that we will ever get. I always tell my couples, like, yeah, if you like each other and you get along, good. I'm glad. I hope so, right? Like, you have fun, you have shared interests, like, you laugh together, you find each other funny, right? All of that stuff. Good. High five each other. That's amazing. But how you do conflict is going to be what sets you apart. Conflict is information if you're willing to listen to it. To me, it's this like red flag in the sand that says something really, really, really important is going on in your and your partner's internal world. And if you take a moment to pause in that space and actually like move yourself into this space of, okay, how do I care about what is happening in that other person's experience? Just as important as how I care about what's happening in mine. And listen, sometimes this shit is really, really hard. But when you come back to it, when you can start asking yourself those questions and say, I need to know what's here because there's an origin story. There's a story. There's something here that is activating something in this other person that is bringing this forward in such a way that wants to disconnect, that wants to shut down, that wants to, bring the claws out. And that means that there's something really important for me to understand about you and something really important for you to understand about me. And if we can make a deal here and bring both of those things forward on the table, we're going to learn something very important about ourselves and each other, which is going to build out intimacy, a deep understanding, beautiful connection. I can't tell you how much intimacy and connection I have gained from moving through conflict well.
Yeah,
truly. Yeah.
I can't agree more, Vienna. And the language I always use is our triggers are our teachers. And what we're talking about here is very acutely triggering moments that happen in one of two ways. When one partner is triggered, so something happens in my world, and this would happen often even in my own relationship. Something would happen or not happen, and I would assign a meaning that touched upon, and I love that you talked about wanting to be seen, heard, connected with, because some of us as individuals carry core wounds. One of mine is not feeling seen and heard by a completely emotionally absent mother. So this wound for me in my partnership was triggered right and left, especially at the beginning of my relationship. And that wasn't that wasn't a two-person conflict, interestingly enough, or at least it didn't start out as one. That would start out as me feeling triggered because I would assign a million different, instances that meaning. Oh, here's another way that my partner is not considering or seeing me. Obviously, I would erupt or detach whatever I was, needed to do in the moment to keep me safe. And then my partner oftentimes is left confused at what the heck is happening because I'm having such a big emotional response. And then I think there's a conflict as well that's even more difficult to navigate when both parties, whether or not it started, in a mutual eruption or one thing was said by one of the partners and then it devolved or erupted. And now both parties are having something, like you said, very deep happening where both individuals are attempting to move to their own safety, sometimes in very different ways. And I work with a million couples who have this of, kind of one partner is wanting to avoid, and that is triggering the other partner wound who is now trying to chase, and then the snowball goes running down the middle. But I think that's important to note that there are those different types of entries into conflict, because talk about origin story, we get into conflict, I think, in both of those paths.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's, there's a reason why some of us want to resolve immediately. There's a reason why some of us want to distance and get away from it. Or if we track backwards, we're going to see why that's in place. And yes, that cycle of pursuer, distancer, and, safety needing to be away from the conflict versus safety needing to be with that person. Don't you dare leave me. We need to do this right now. You can't go to bed with with anger or conflict, some of those narratives. And yeah, it's not lost on us that, you see almost all couples have a very different style from one another. You're like, how did we meet
Yes,
so
all the
that
time.
we are always, right? Like, how is it that you and I have this different way of doing it? And that's, it's that opportunity for growth, right? There's a reason why we partner with people. And there becomes this beautiful space when we stretch it and we see it, where the healing can happen, where yes, those core wounds like you were talking about, right? I do believe that, most of us have something in there that really activates our system and gets us going. And ideally we are doing some of this prep work where, you don't just talk about conflict when you're in the middle of it. That is very, very hard to do. But when you are actually outside of the conflict experience, really getting to know yourself and getting to know your partner. It's one of the things that we talk about in the course, the Get the Love You Want course, where you move yourself out of this space and you start to bring awareness to, what are my core wounds, right? What is my defense mechanism? What's my coping style? What do I do when I'm feeling threatened? And when you start to get to know this part of yourself and this part of your partner, if you are partnered right now, it does bring beautiful awareness, because then when you do transition into that conflict state, which it will happen, and it will, guess what, happen for the rest of our lives. Like, it's just going to be there, right? It's like you have a deeper sense of awareness that you can tap into when that activation happens. Again, like I was saying before, it's not always that you tap into it in the moment. Yes, ideally, like if we can get that practice into that space, that is beautiful. But that when you have that deeper sense of awareness, because you're building it outside of a conflict scenario, that really is deeply helpful for a system to be able to navigate and to say, well, what do I want to be responsible for when we get into conflict, right? What is one thing that I can bring awareness to? What's one thing that you can bring awareness to? What are we committed to? And then sometimes when we're actually in that space, one of us or both of us can hold ourselves accountable to it, right? When we know, when we've named it, when we've said it out loud and said, like, I know I'm guilty of this, right? Like, I am the point prover. I know that I can go into that space. I'm like, I'm going to show you how you're wrong. And I'm going to tell you exactly how, like why it's this way. And I'm going to keep going until you see that I am right, And, Connor in our conflict will sometimes be like, point prover. And it will like dislodge it for me, because we've, obviously we've had a lot of practice with it, but it can be something that starts to shift ourselves out of the programming of like, this is what I need to do. This is where I'm headed, and I'm going to do it at all costs because I don't want to take my partner down with me. Right? Even though in that, like you said, from little T to big T, obviously our number one goal is to move ourselves into safety. But if you are dealing with a partner with whom you believe, actually has your best interest at heart, which is not everybody, right? So that's not every person who's watching this and listening to this. Not everybody has a partner who's actually standing shoulder to shoulder and wants to do this work. And sometimes you actually do need to move yourself to because you actually are in harm's way, right? So we're actually right now we're talking about people who have the capacity, who are doing it, who want to do this. Not if you're in an abusive relationship where you are actually needing to move yourself there. But the narrative that we want is that I am safe with you, and I know that. Right. And that leaning into you, right, and you leaning into me is safety. And it's that we're trying to override that thought and that narrative, that getting away from you and proving my point or whatever it is what's going to lead me to safety. I am overriding that thought to say, actually, with you, I am the safest when both of us can start to shift ourselves out of the coping style or the defense strategy or whatever else is being thrown into the mix there.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, Vienna, because the reality of it is we can do our own work separately, even if we're not in a
Hmm.
committed partnership, or even if we are,
Yes.
to know ourselves, like you said, to know our stories, our wounds, and then the
Hmm.
way our defenses around those wounds. And that is, as I see it, the responsibility for each of us as partners,
Has
whether or
to
not
be.
we're in that relationship now or not. And,
Yes.
but you're bringing up a great point, because a question I do get asked a lot is, okay, if I'm responsible for myself, do I open myself up to abuse or to boundary violations? Absolutely not.
Hmm.
We can know
Hmm.
ourselves and own our part in conflict, and
Hmm.
still, have a definitive line around what's okay and what's not okay. And the reality of it is, not all of us are going to find ourselves in that safe partnership. So
That's
the
right.
things aren't mutually exclusive. Owning our
Hmm.
responsibility for the part that we're playing in a conflict doesn't mean that we are absolving partners who are egregiously crossing
Hmm.
boundaries, because that's just not the case. And I think the reality of it is, as we get better over time, we can start to be more and more aware. The language I use is conscious in the moment, so that one of us, I love how you put that, can hold
Hmm.
accountability for the system. But that
Yes.
doesn't happen overnight. So it does start by one of us calling it, when once we've reached a point of
Hmm.
escalation that's no longer going to be helpful for the safety of the partnership, because that
Yeah.
happens. I know it happens with me, and I know, especially when our corest of wounds are touched and
Hmm.
both of us are in that really emotional reactive state, there comes a point of no return. So sometimes putting a pin in
Hmm.
it and addressing it later, but our goal is in real time, like
Yeah.
you're stating, to be able to hold accountability, to call to conscious mind
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
reality that this is someone in front of you, even though your subconscious is screaming that, no, this is the
Yep.
the villain and the
Yep.
perpetrator in the moment, that it's actually not the
Hmm.
case, that this is a human who does have your best
Yes.
interest in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when I oftentimes feel like the more the conflict builds, you can see more of the hurt part actually being activated, which has always been very helpful for me, because I think every once in a while, when I really can see the hurt in my partner, all of a sudden the rest of it moves away from me, and that becomes the priority, where it's like, now when I'm just as hurt, that's much harder, right? So, listen, in conflict, not all conflict is created equally. Sometimes it's very clear that, like, I've done something that has really hurt you, right? And then there's moments where it's very clear that you've done something that's really hurt me. Every once in a while, we are like very equally hurt, where it's like, oh yeah, like, no, I'm not going to give up any inches here. When we know that, when we see that our partner is deeply hurting, and maybe we're not in the same space as they are, I have always found it really important to see, my partner as a young boy, and I can see like the kid in him, and obviously you talk so much about, healing the inner child, and I think that work around, and that language around the inner child within, and knowing that template story, right, that origin story, wherever it took up place, whether it was at 6 or 12, or whatever age it is being able to see that, there is an inner child who's activated right now, and I love that inner child, I love this person, and I love that inner child, and all I want to do is create safety for you, so let me move my stuff aside and show up. And again, really hard work to do, but um, in our course, we talk so much about how to do this, right? Not just the awareness around, oh, like these aha moments of this is what it looks like, and let me understand why I do this, and oh, great, I get it. My parents fought in this way, or they fought with me in this way, and so that's why I am the way that I am. It's, we have to take it further, and we have to do the integration work. And I think that's where so many of us get caught, is moving it from our awareness and what it is that I know about myself, and these aha moments and all of these like light bulbs that are going off, into the practice, right? The action and the integration of the work that we're doing. And so it's work,
Yeah.
as we all know, it's work, but it can be done. And
Yeah.
that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, 100%. And I've actually seen that on a really global scale, Vienna, where this is one of the limitations, as far as I saw it, of just the standard therapy model too, because we can have a beautifully conscious, insight, driven conversation where we totally get it and we know exactly what we're going to do differently the next time. And then the next time happens and we're right back into that wounded subconscious place. So translating that insight or that consciousness or the awareness, as I put it, into the two steps of change, is that being the first one, making the second one, the change, the breaking these patterns ever possible, does not happen without that insight. However, there's a big hurdle in between that step one and step two that I believe we struggle with, whether or not it's in conflict with couples. I know that's what you and I are talking about today. In general, in life, my old patterns come sneaking out when I'm emotionally activated. And that definitely does apply to couples. So tell me a little bit about this course that you have going. It sounds like really helpful to give some of these more practical tools of, okay, because I know a lot of listeners out there have insight in spades and still find themselves in conflict and not resolving this conflicts in a helpful way within their partnership. So tell me a little bit about your course.
Yeah, totally. It's I feel really proud about the course. We've run it once before and got really good feedback. And I think, for anybody who's ever run a course, you're like, I don't know until we do it the first time, like how this is going to really land. So it was really lovely to get such positive feedback from people. So the course is a 6-week sort of self-led course, right? You can do it at the speed that works for you. Lifetime access. And we do focus a little bit on self-awareness, relational awareness at the beginning. And then we take you through conflict, boundaries, and then sex and intimacy, and like really deep modules that are videos, that are PDFs with, prompts and questions and journaling. You take it on your own or in a partnership, it really doesn't matter, because this is about bringing a deep sense of awareness and then looking at these patterns that keep us stuck and finding the way to actually integrate change. For me, exactly what you said, Nicole, is that we are both trained in sort of like the models, the academic models. And I also found it to be really challenging, where it's like you sort of got stuck in this loop of awareness and having these revelations and these aha moments. And I became really frustrated in, wait, where's the integration part of this? And that's what this course really is about, is moving us, yes, from the awareness into the integration, and having things that are long lasting, that create that change, that just create the new programming and the conditioning, so that the practice, like practice makes new programming.
Yes.
I grew up with the practice makes perfect model. I don't know if you heard that growing up. I heard that growing up playing the violin. Practice makes perfect, which now for me has shifted into practice makes new programming. And that's what we are doing here. And that's what the course does, in a way that does ask you to dive in and do some heavy lifting, but gives you, real life examples. We do live coaching calls to dive in a little bit further. And, for me, I think the boundaries, conflict, and sex and intimacy, with a sort of bigger framework of constant self-awareness and relational awareness, are some of the most important things that we need to manage and figure out within the context of any relationship, right? Yes, we are more geared towards the romantic relationships, but whether it's relationship with family members, relationship to self, conflict with self. I mean, this is where it's like, you don't need a partner to do this work, like you don't even have to have had a partner to do this work. We have a lot of evidence and a lot of examples of family system stuff, or you with you, that can give you the tools where you can start implementing the tools with your own self, and building out that structure and that strategy and that programming and that conditioning to do it differently if and when you move into a romantic relationship. So I'm super proud of the course. It's amazing. I love it. I think everybody should take it, honestly, just because it's one of those things that you have to move from self-awareness into integration. I want as many people to take it and see it as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think the way we relate in relationships is often reflective of our relationship with ourselves, first and foremost. And the reality of it is, there are many different types of relationships. Intimacy does span friendships and family-based relationships. We don't have to just be speaking of physical intimacy, I think that we, you know, often think of in terms of the romantic relationship, but there are multiple types of intimacies. And I love that you highlighted boundaries and then sex and intimacy, because again, even in our romantic relationships, boundaries are really still important. And that does not absolve us just because this is the person with whom that we're married or committed to for life, or in that deepest level of relationship with. That doesn't absolve that relationship from having boundaries in and of itself. And I believe that conflict in and of itself actually can sometimes be and the lack of resolution in conflict, I should say, can prevent the depth of intimacy just as much as our patterns and our programs and things we learned. A lot of us, I think, struggle in terms of developing, and like I said, intimacy on a big global sense, not just physical intimacy. I also love, as I'm sure you're going to know, I'm going to say this, that you're highlighting practice, because that's the reality. There is no, as I say it, magic wand. I can't read a book and then just, the next time I'm in this situation, I'm going to do it differently. It really is, in my opinion, about practicing, repetition, learning from each and every misstep that we gain shifts and changes in these deepest ways.
Yeah. And I think too, for me, you know, I do work with couples a lot, and individuals within the context of relationships. But I think, you know, moving from like book to practice, or, you know, hearing some insight to practice, it's like, it's crazy. I calculated this before, like months ago. I don't even know, maybe 6 months ago, that I had done 12,000 direct contact hours with couples. And I say that because I think in theory, we can talk about what goes into creating a healthy relationship. And, you know, these are some of the things that you should do. But I really, truly believe that unless you are working with couples, you don't really see what is actually going on. It is so much harder than what the theory might suggest. And I think for me, this idea of like, the fact that I have worked with so many couples and have really seen where people get stuck and where it becomes just harder than just like follow the 5 steps here is such an important part that I've been able to bring into the course. So
yeah. Well, actually, Vienna, I think that makes you, isn't it 10,000 hours makes you a master? So where can we find the practice from the relationship master yourself? Where can anyone out there listening who is interested, whether they're single or partnered at the current moment, or maybe just struggling in family relationships, where can they get more information on your course?
So our course launches on September 11th. So we are only taking registration up until then. And the link for it is in my bio on Instagram, which is at mindfulmft. It's also on my website, which is newyorkcouplescounseling.com. And I think you're going to link it too, right?
I sure am.
Yeah. So I think they'll find it in lots of different locations. But yeah, we have a couple of weeks before we get started here, and so pumped to be able to chat about this with you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, that's incredible. And absolutely, everyone out there listening, I will link it below in the show notes, but I do urge you, I'm happy you got your handle out there. I do urge you to, everyone listening, to go over, give a follow. You give great information, and I'm sure we'll be keeping in any future course launches, keeping updated. And I super appreciate finally getting to more officially connect with you and have this chat. This was incredible. Thank you so much, Vienna.
Thank you, Nicole.